If you're not aware, we're still actually in a pandemic. The World Health Organization has not downgraded us from a pandemic to an endemic. We're actually still very much in the fight against COVID-19. But fortunately, we're out of the major restrictions. However, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted upon our lives? We're all aware of the issues associated with medicine, health, and even mental stress. But what about other aspects, such as human rights? This morning I'm joined by Ms. Denise Pitcher. She is the Executive Director of the Caribbean Center for Human Rights, and she's with us via Zoom. Good morning, Ms. Pitcher.
Good morning, Ketan. Thank you for having us.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. The COVID-19 pandemic, there were measures implemented by various governments throughout the world, including Trinidad and Tobago's government, such as the state of emergency, such as lockdown, which led to the restrictions of fundamental human rights, and even measures taken with regards to the rule of law. And it's a general question, in what ways has this impacted upon the conversation and perhaps the implementation of human rights?
So, in states of emergencies or in emergency situations such as these public health emergencies, the state, they do have a right based on international human rights law and in the Constitution to suspend human rights to protect, the wider public health and to mitigate any risks to life. So what we've observed, of course, we've had restriction on freedom of movement with border closures, lockdowns, closures of schools, work from home. All of those measures were implemented to mitigate the risk and to contain the spread of the virus. But when states are implementing these measures, they must make sure that it's legal, proportionate to the risks or the threats posed, and also within a specific time frame. It's not supposed to be, indefinite. They're supposed to be as long as the threat, relevant or in relation to the risks posed.
How would you describe Trinidad and Tobago's institutions to defend fundamental liberties and ensure that best practice in terms of human rights are certainly in place?
I'm sorry. Can you rephrase that?
How would you describe, or how would you judge Trinidad and Tobago's institutional capacities to actually defend fundamental liberties and ensure that human rights are in place, human rights are practiced, fundamental human rights, that is?
So, Trinidad and Tobago, we generally enjoy a relatively high level of human rights in terms of freedom of expression, freedom of movement, access to health, access to education. One of the things that we have mentioned in the past is access to justice. That seems to be a big gap in terms of our institutional capacity for the enjoyment of human rights.
But in terms of our public policy, in terms of government's handling of situations, how is it important for the government to keep updating the nation as to their fight to ensure that human rights are practiced?
I guess in terms of, revision of public policies, public participation, including public participation in the decision-making process when they are, deliberating on what public policies are necessary, either to restrict human rights or to advance human rights. That's really, really important. Making sure that, yes, necessary information is there in terms of, what rights might be infringed on. And I think the government, during the course of the pandemic was very, very good in terms of communicating information in terms of what would happen in terms of, health information. So I think in that respect, the government did a really good job in communication.
Now, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic and even following lockdowns and restrictions here in Trinidad and Tobago, issues were raised with instances such as detention centers and even instances of having COVID-19 facilities. Has such issues been resolved, or is the organization still fighting a battle that seems to be getting nowhere or improving?
So one of the measures that the government implemented during the pandemic was the establishment of this, I guess, temporary detention facility at the Chaguaramas heliport that was meant to deal with migrants coming into the country in order to contain the spread, which at the time, in compliance with international human rights law, and also, with, similar to measures taken globally, would have been, legitimate and proportionate to the risk posed. However, that heliport has now become a de facto detention facility. And, the risks, everybody else in Trinidad and Tobago, more or less, the restrictions have been lifted. And this heliport is not a legitimate detention facility. The concerns by CCHR is this detention facility, or this facility in the heliport, which is based in Chaguaramas, in a military base, does it meet the criteria of an immigration detention facility? And the concerns that we have as well too is, of course, there's ongoing indefinite detention of persons. Then even more concerning, we continue to receive reports about sexual assault, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation of women and girls in the heliport. And because it's based in a military base, because it's located in a military base, it restricts access to groups like us and other human rights groups that may want to conduct monitoring exercises to be able to, to verify if they meet, international human rights standards. Another concern as well too is because it's not a legitimate detention facility, and it's run by Coast Guard officials, and it's not run by immigration officials. So there's a question of what training do they have, what technical expertise do they have, these Coast Guard, to deal with immigration detention issues. Are they sensitive to the needs of persons seeking asylum, sensitive to the needs of migrants, sensitive to the needs, the different needs of women and girls, of children, because children do also end up in these detention facilities, from this particular facility, from time to time. So that's a big concern for us.
Now, you've raised some points there which I've taken note of, but you've also raised very serious allegations. Now, the allegations are not specific to whether or not it's military individuals actually engaging in such abuse, or if it's from other men who have been detained, or even other women. However, has the organization been in communication with the relevant authorities, such as the Ministry of National Security or even the Office of the Attorney General, to raise such issues and such concerns?
So because there are recent reports that just came out over the weekend, we're still trying to establish some facts and clarify what the situation is. But there was a recent report that's very, very concerning that's been circulating. So until we have more information on that situation and on the ongoing situation, accusations, allegations against, state officials running that facility, then we will, reach out and request. We think is necessary now to request access to the facility to at least conduct some monitoring exercises. Of course, because it's in a military facility, we may face, some challenges in terms of being granted access.
Now, what recommendations would you make to try and actually decrease such negative impacts and to mitigate the risk of such reoccurrences in the future? What would be some of the recommendations that you would put forward?
So, I mean, in general, in terms of what measures state adopt to deal with, public health emergencies like COVID-19. The government should, approach any measures, integrate a human rights approach. So, for example, with this detention facility specifically, even though it may have been necessary and legal and proportionate to the risk at the time, there doesn't seem to be an awareness, or at least any sort of human rights approach that was integrated in terms of, what the needs of asylum seekers would be in terms of the indefinite detention. And of course, because, these are asylum seekers, they need to be dealt with by persons that are specifically trained to deal with asylum seekers and refugees, because they're a particularly vulnerable population. And so in that respect, it's important that, governments take into consideration those needs. We could also extend it to where we did school lockdowns as well too, and now where we're seeing, there are lots of behaviors manifesting after prolonged lockdown of children at home, and their development needs being delayed because of these lockdowns. So again, it's about identifying what the issues might be in terms of what these types of measures would impose, and then also trying to look at it through that human rights lens, to be able to allow people to continue to enjoy their rights without having it completely removed during these measures.
Arguably, given the nature of this conversation and where we are right now from where we've started, the biggest impact that COVID-19 and the pandemic has had on human rights, specifically to Trinbago, is mostly to do with our immigration policies and our immigration position and stance. Is that the case?
I'm sorry, can you just repeat the question?
Arguably, given the nature of this conversation, is it fair
Yeah.
to suggest that the COVID-19 pandemic, its impact on human rights, specifically to Trinbago, has been mostly on our immigration policy?
Definitely. I mean, the border closures, this detention facility, we had, an extended, border closure in relation to other nations around the world. And, that limits a person's ability to access asylum. And we've emphasized in the past, to engage in measures where that right is not completely taken away from, even in public health emergencies, rights should be, to the full extent where possible, enjoyed. And the government should take every necessary measure to be able to, for that enjoyment of rights, as long as it doesn't, pose a tremendous threat to public health. But the enjoyment of rights is important. And yes, our Immigration Act and immigration policies have been particularly harsh. And now we're seeing a situation where this measure has been extended beyond the public health emergency, and it's now putting vulnerable persons who already face risks at even further risks. So yes, definitely the immigration policies with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic, yes, they're definitely worrying, concerning.
Well, Ms. Pitcher, I want to thank you very much for joining me on the program this morning, and thank you for raising that final point with regards to the immigration policy. Certainly something to have further examination and further conversation on. But thank you very much for the conversation this morning.
Thank you for having us.